The stage lights of the National Youth Showcase felt like a warm, heavy blanket. But for 8-year-old Leo, they were less comforting and more like a spotlight pointing out every single thing that was wrong. He could feel a tiny drop of sweat making its way down his temple, and he was suddenly very aware of his scuffed dress shoes. They were his Sunday best, but they had seen a lot of playground time. From the wings, the grand piano sitting center stage looked less like an instrument and more like a giant black monster with gleaming white teeth. It was as big as the family car, and the thought of having to play it made his hands feel clammy and his heart do a funny little pitter-pat against his ribs. Out in the audience, hidden in a sea of faces, his mother, Maria, felt like she was the one about to perform. Her hands were clasped together so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned a pale white. She wasn't praying, not exactly. But she was sending every hopeful thought she had across the room, trying to wrap it around her small son like a protective shield. This moment had cost them everything. She remembered the late nights, the extra shifts at the diner, the way she had smiled and said no to a new winter coat for herself so that the entry fee for this competition could be paid. Her friends had thought she was crazy. "It's just a local showcase, Maria," they had said. "He's just a boy." But they didn't see what she saw. They didn't hear what she heard in their tiny living room every evening. The sound that could turn a rainy day into a symphony. At the long, polished judge's table, the atmosphere was one of bored professionalism. The head judge, Alistair Finch, was a man whose name was spoken with reverence in the world of classical music. He had fingers that had danced across the world's most famous stages, and an ear that could spot a wrong note from a mile away. But after years of listening to countless children, most of them pushed onto the stage by overly ambitious parents, his patience had worn thin. He had seen it all. The kids who played with robotic precision but no soul. The kids who forgot their pieces midway through, the kids who burst into tears. He sighed softly, tapping his expensive pen on his notepad. Ready for another round of disappointment? Then Leo walked out. A collective, almost imperceptible shift went through the auditorium. He was so small, a tiny figure in a slightly too large navy blue suit. His bow tie was a little crooked, and his hair was mussed in a way that suggested his mother had tried to smooth it down just moments before he came on stage. He walked with a nervous shuffle, his eyes fixed on the piano, as if it were the only safe place in a room full of staring eyes. Alistair Finch watched him approach, a familiar sense of pity mixed with annoyance washing over him. Another one, he thought. A parent's dream, a child's nightmare. He could already picture the hesitant, plodding melody of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or some other simple tune that was completely inappropriate for a national showcase. Leo finally reached the bench. It was a long, glossy stretch of wood, and he had to hoist himself up onto it, his small legs dangling far above the pedals. He wiggled forward, perching on the very edge, just to be able to reach the keys. The sight was almost comical, a little boy playing at being a concert pianist on a throne that was far too big for him. A few people in the audience let out soft, sympathetic chuckles. Alistair Finch didn't chuckle, but a small, cynical smirk played on his lips. He glanced at the judge next to him, a woman named Eleanor who shared his world-weary expression, and they exchanged a look that said it all. This was going to be over quickly and not pleasantly. Alistair leaned forward, his voice crackling slightly through the microphone, filled with a practiced, gentle condescension. "And what are you playing for us today, young man?" The question hung in the air, a test. Most children would mumble something incoherent at this point. Leo took a shaky breath. He looked out at the vast, dark room, then down at his own small hands resting on the keys. He thought of his mom, of her tired smile, of the way she would hum along when he played. He gathered all the courage he had in his small body, and his voice, though quiet and a bit squeaky, was clear. "La Campanella," he said. The name of the piece landed in the silent auditorium like a stone. For a second, there was nothing. Then, a ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd like a wave. It started with the musicians in the audience, the ones who knew. They turned to each other with wide, incredulous eyes. La Campanella, the little bell, wasn't just a song. It was a legend. A piece of music so notoriously difficult, so packed with lightning-fast notes and tricky jumps, that it was considered a Mount Everest for pianists. It was a piece that seasoned virtuosos practiced for years, sometimes decades, to master. The idea that this small, nervous boy, whose feet couldn't even reach the pedals, would attempt it was absurd. Alistair Finch's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at the boy, his pen frozen midair. This wasn't just a joke. It was an insult. Was this some kind of prank? A publicity stunt? He looked from the boy's serious, determined face to his mother in the front row, whose own face had gone pale with a mixture of terror and pride. She knew what he was playing. She had let him walk into this slaughter. The judge's shock quickly turned to anger. This was a waste of everyone's time. It was cruel to the boy to set him up for such a public, catastrophic failure. He was about to pick up his microphone to stop this before it even began, to tell the boy to choose something else, something sensible. But he was too late. Leo had already closed his eyes, his small fingers finding their starting position on the ivory keys. The room held its breath, waiting for the inevitable disaster. The first note that Leo played was not the confident, sparkling ring that La Campanella demanded. It was a soft, hesitant tap, almost like a question. The sound was thin and small, immediately swallowed by the vastness of the auditorium. It was the kind of sound you'd expect from a child's first piano lesson, not from a national stage. Alistair Finch let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, a quiet sigh of confirmation. It was exactly as he'd predicted. The boy was lost. He watched as Leo's small fingers, which looked even tinier against the long white keys, plodded forward. The melody that emerged was a simple, childlike version of the tune, played with a halting uncertainty that was almost painful to watch. Each note was separated by a tiny gap of silence, a pause where the boy seemed to be searching for the next one. His brow furrowed in deep concentration. From her seat in the front row, Maria felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't her Leo. This wasn't the boy who played with such joy and freedom in their living room, his feet swinging happily from the piano stool as he filled their small home with music. This was a frightened child, and every wrong note, every moment of hesitation, felt like a personal failure. She saw a woman a few rows ahead turn to her friend and whisper behind her program, a sympathetic but pitying look on her face. Maria's heart sank. Had she been a fool? A selfish mother who pushed her son into the spotlight for her own dreams? She remembered the night before, Leo lying in bed, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. "Mom, what if I forget?" he had whispered. She had held him close and said, "Then you just start again. The music is inside you, remember?" But now, watching him struggle under the harsh lights, she wondered if the music had gotten scared and hidden away. On stage, Leo was fighting a silent battle. The piano felt enormous, its keys like wide, icy steps he had to climb. His fingers, which usually felt so nimble at home, now felt stiff and clumsy, like little sausages trying to do a delicate dance. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him, hundreds of invisible weights pressing down on his small shoulders. He knew he was messing up. The beautiful, fast-flowing river of music he heard in his head was coming out like a trickle from a clogged faucet. He was playing the simplest parts of the melody, the parts he knew by heart, but he couldn't seem to connect them. He was too scared to try the hard jumps, the fast runs that made the piece so special. He was just trying to survive, to get through it without making a complete fool of himself. He thought of his mom's smiling face and pushed on, his fingers feeling heavy as lead. Alistair Finch had seen enough. He picked up his pen and scribbled a single, sharp word on his notepad. Unsuitable. Wasn't angry anymore. He was just irritated. This was a waste of precious time. There were other contestants waiting, some of whom might actually have a modicum of talent. This whole performance felt like a publicity stunt, or worse, a cruel act of parenting. He glanced at Eleanor, the judge beside him. She gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod, her expression one of weary resignation. They had both been on this panel for years, and they could both spot a lost cause within the first 30 seconds. This one was not just lost, it was shipwrecked. The boy was clearly talented enough to learn the notes, but he had no business being on this stage. attempting a piece that was beyond the grasp of 99% of professional pianists. It was a setup for public humiliation, and Alistair had no desire to be a part of the spectacle. The audience was getting restless. The initial sympathy was starting to curdle into impatience. A few people had shifted in their seats. The low murmur of whispers that had started when Leo announced his piece had returned, this time with a tinge of boredom. People started checking their phones. The magic of the moment, the tension of the impossible challenge, had evaporated and been replaced by the awkward reality of watching a child struggle. The music was not just bad. It was boring. It was a slow, stumbling tune, with no energy, no passion, no life. It was the musical equivalent of watching someone try to run a marathon with their shoelaces tied together. It was sad, and it was going on for too long. Alistair made a decision. He could not let this continue. It was not fair to the boy who was clearly crumbling under the pressure, and it was not fair to the audience. He put his pen down with a decisive click and leaned forward towards his microphone. The small movement caught the attention of the people in the front rows. A hush began to fall over the crowd as they sensed that something was about to happen. Maria saw the judge move, and her heart leaped into her throat. She knew what was coming. The gentle but firm dismissal. The tap on the shoulder. The "Thank you, young man, that's enough." She wanted to scream, "No, just give him one more minute." But she was frozen, a prisoner in her seat. Leo, however, was lost in his own world of panic. He didn't see the judge move. He didn't see the audience shifting. All he could see was the black and white landscape of the piano keys, a treacherous path he was trying to navigate. He had just fumbled a chord, his fingers landing on 3 notes that sounded clashing and wrong. A small gasp went through the audience. It was the final straw. Alistair Finch cleared his throat. The sound amplified slightly through the speakers, a clear signal that he was about to speak. He was ready to put an end to this well-intentioned tragedy, to save the boy from any further embarrassment. He opened his mouth to form the words that would stop the music. Alistair Finch's mouth was open, the words of dismissal forming on his tongue. His finger was poised, ready to press the button on his console that would light up the red stop sign, signal he had used only a handful of times in his long career. The wrong chord Leo had played still echoed in the sudden hush, a final clumsy nail in the coffin of this failed audition. The audience was braced for it, the awkward mercy-killing. Maria had her eyes squeezed shut, unable to watch. But in that split second, just as the judge was about to speak, something happened. The wrong note didn't send Leo into a tailspin of panic. It did the opposite. It was as if that tiny moment of failure broke the spell of fear that had been holding him captive. His eyes, which had been darting around the room like a frightened animal, snapped shut. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and his entire body changed. The small, hunched-over boy on the bench seemed to grow an inch. His shoulders, which had been slumped in defeat, straightened. His back, once a curve of nervousness, became a firm, confident line. The nervous boy vanished, and in his place sat a musician. A tiny monarch on his grand, black throne, and then his fingers took over. The first few notes after the shift were not hesitant. They were sharp, clear, and precise. They were the same melody he had been stumbling through, but now it was played with a new sense of purpose. It was a declaration. Before Alistair could even process the change, the simple melody began to grow. It twisted and turned, weaving itself into a more complex pattern. Then, without warning, it exploded. A storm of sound erupted from the piano, a dizzying cascade of notes that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Leo's fingers, which had moments before seemed so stiff and clumsy, were now a blur of motion. They flew across the keyboard. Leaping from one end to the other with an impossible speed and accuracy, Alistair Finch's hand froze. Inches from the microphone, his mouth remained open, but the words were gone, replaced by a silent gasp. His brain, a finely tuned instrument for musical analysis, was struggling to catch up. What he was hearing was not just good, it was technically perfect. The runs, the series of rapid-fire notes that trip up even the most seasoned professionals, were executed with a flawless liquid smoothness. The wide jumps, where the left hand has to leap across the entire keyboard to land on a single precise note, were not just accurate. They were effortless. It was like watching a magician pull off an impossible trick right before your very eyes. The shift in the auditorium was just as dramatic. The restless shuffling stopped. The whispers died. The phones that had been out were now forgotten, clutched in laps or dropped onto the floor. A collective audible gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a silence so deep and profound it felt heavier than sound. Every single person was leaning forward, their eyes fixed on the small boy at the piano. The awkwardness of moments before was replaced by a sense of collective awe, a feeling that they were all witnessing something that defied explanation. Maria opened her eyes. The sound that filled the hall was a sound she knew, but it was bigger, more powerful than she had ever heard it. It was her Leo. This was the boy who played for hours in their living room. His face scrunched up in concentration, his feet swinging too high above the pedals. But this was that boy amplified, his talent unleashed on a grand scale. Tears began to stream down her face, but they were not tears of sadness or worry anymore. They were tears of pure, overwhelming pride and joy. She wasn't just watching her son play a song. She was watching his soul pour out of his fingertips. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. On stage, Leo was lost in a world of his own creation. His eyes were still closed, shutting out the judges, the audience, the blinding lights. There was only him and the music. His body swayed gently with the rhythm, a small, unconscious dance that showed he was feeling every single note. The La Campanella is famous for its little bell effect, a series of high, delicate, ringing notes that are supposed to sound like tiny, perfect chimes. Leo's right hand made it happen. His fingers danced on the high keys, plucking out the melody with a clarity and lightness that was breathtaking. The bells didn't just ring. They shimmered, cutting through the powerful, thundering chords from his left hand. It was a conversation between a delicate bird and a roaring lion. Dad! And Leo was conducting both. Alistair Finch was no longer a judge. He was a fan. He had forgotten all about his notepad, his scores, his role in this competition. He was simply a man who loved music, listening to a performance that was rewriting everything he thought he knew. He had heard the world's greatest pianists play this piece. He had played it himself, but he had never heard it played like this. There was a raw, untamed joy in Leo's performance, a purity that was often lost in the quest for technical perfection. This boy wasn't just playing the notes correctly. He was telling a story with them. The music was full of life, full of passion, full of a child's wonder and an old master's soul. The smirk that had been on Alistair's face just a few minutes ago felt like a memory from another lifetime. It had been replaced by an expression of sheer, unadulterated wonder. He looked over at Eleanor, the judge beside him, saw his own astonishment mirrored in her wide, unblinking eyes. The music continued to build, growing in speed and complexity. It was a waterfall of sound, a river of notes flowing so fast it seemed impossible that one person, let alone a small 8-year-old boy, could be creating it. The sound filled every corner of the vast auditorium, vibrating in the floorboards. In the seats, in the chests of the spellbound audience, people were holding their breath, afraid that even the smallest sound might break the magic. The performance was no longer just a performance. It was an event. It was the kind of story people would tell for years, the kind of moment that reminds you why you fell in love with music in the first place. The boy who had walked on stage looking like a frightened rabbit was now a musical giant, and his fingers were still taking over the piano, weaving a spell that had captured everyone, most especially the judge who had been so ready to dismiss him. The music was no longer just a sound. It was a living, breathing entity that filled the vast auditorium, pressing against the walls and the ceiling, seeping into the very bones of everyone present. Leo's fingers were a whirlwind of impossible motion, a blur of flesh and bone that seemed to defy the laws of physics. They danced and leaped, flew and fluttered, creating a tapestry of sound so intricate and so powerful it was hard to believe it was coming from one person, let alone a small boy. The final section of the piece was upon them, the most ferocious and demanding part of the entire composition. It was a sprint to the finish line, a dizzying cascade of notes that built in speed and volume. Layer upon layer of sound, creating a storm of breathtaking intensity, Leo's whole body was now part of the performance. He leaned into the piano, his small frame swaying with the force of the music. His head was bent in concentration, his face a mask of pure focus. But there was a joy there, too, a visible delight in the creation of such a magnificent sound. The powerful, thundering chords from his left hand were the foundation of a great, roaring waterfall, while his right hand was the spray of mist at the top, shimmering and sparkling with the delicate, high-pitched notes of the little bell. The contrast was stunning. It was a battle between raw power and delicate beauty, and Leo was the master of both. The audience was no longer a collection of individuals. They were a single, unified entity, holding a collective breath, their hearts beating in time with the frantic rhythm of the music. They were on a journey, and this small boy was their guide, taking them to a place they had never been before. Then it happened. The music reached its absolute peak, a frantic, breathtaking flurry of notes that seemed to hang in the air for a moment, a snapshot of pure, unadulterated energy. And then, with a final decisive motion, Leo's hands came down on the keys. The last chord was not just a sound. It was an event. It was a thunderous, resonant crash that shook the very floorboards, a wave of sound so powerful it felt like a physical force. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, the sound of a final, undeniable statement. And then, as the vibrations of the chord began to fade, a strange and wonderful thing occurred. Silence. It wasn't the quiet that comes when a song is over, and people start to cough and shuffle their feet. It was a heavy, profound, sacred silence. It was the kind of silence that follows a miracle, a moment so overwhelming that no one dared to be the first to break it. The final notes of the piano seemed to hang in the air like glittering dust motes, slowly fading into nothingness. But their echo remained in the hearts and minds of everyone in the room. For a full 10 seconds, the auditorium was frozen in time. The stage lights seemed to dim. The world outside ceased to exist, and there was only the shared, breathtaking memory of what they had just witnessed. At the judges' table, Alistair Finch was a statue. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide and unblinking. The expensive pen he had been holding had slipped from his fingers and lay on his notepad, forgotten. His mind, usually a sharp analytical tool, was a complete blank. He was trying to process what he had just heard, but his brain couldn't find the words. Every rule he thought he knew about music, about talent, about practice, and dedication had just been shattered into a million pieces. He had spent his life listening to the best pianists in the world, but he had never heard anything like that. There was a rawness, a purity, a sheer, unadulterated joy in the performance that went far beyond technical perfection. It was the sound of a soul speaking directly to him, and it had left him utterly speechless. He looked at Eleanor, the judge beside him, and saw his own astonishment mirrored in her face. Her hand was covering her mouth, her eyes glistening with tears. They both knew they had just been a part of something special, something that would be talked about for a very long time. In the front row, Maria was no longer crying quietly. Great heaving sobs of joy and relief were shaking her body. She had her hands pressed to her mouth, trying to muffle the sounds, but it was no use. The pressure of the last few months, the worry, the hope, the fear, it all came rushing out in a torrent of emotion. She had known her son was special, but she had never, in her wildest dreams, imagined this. She had seen the doubt in the judge's eyes, she had felt the pity from the audience, and a part of her had been terrified that they were right. But he had shown them. He had shown them all. And in that moment, she felt a pride so fierce and so powerful it felt like it might lift her right out of her seat. The silence was finally broken by a single sound. It was the sharp, distinct clap of a pair of hands, coming from a man in the back row. It was a brave, decisive sound, a lone voice in a sea of quiet. And then, like a dam breaking, another person joined in, then another, and another. Within seconds, the quiet was gone, replaced by a deafening roar of applause and cheers. It started as a wave of sound and quickly became a physical force as people began to get to their feet. One by one, then in groups, then all at once, the entire auditorium rose in a standing ovation. The sound was overwhelming, a thunderous expression of awe and admiration that shook the very foundations of the building. People were yelling "Bravo!" and "Amazing!" Some were wiping away tears. Others were simply standing with their mouths open, clapping as if their lives depended on it and on the stage. At the center of this maelstrom of sound and emotion was Leo. As the last chord faded, the spell that had been holding him seemed to break. The confident musician vanished, and the small, overwhelmed boy returned. He blinked, his eyes slowly adjusting to the light. He looked out at the sea of people, all standing, all clapping, all looking at him. A look of pure confusion crossed his face. He seemed to shrink back into himself, his small frame looking even smaller on the vast piano bench. He wasn't a musical giant anymore. He was just an 8-year-old boy who was suddenly very scared by all the noise. He slid off the bench, his scuffed shoes landing softly on the stage floor, and took a hesitant step back, as if trying to hide from the very people who were showering him with love. He didn't understand. He had just played the music he heard in his head. He didn't know that for everyone else, it had been magic. The wall of sound that hit Leo was physical, like a hot wind. The roaring cheers, the thunderous applause, the cries of "Bravo!" It all blended into one terrifying, overwhelming noise. He took another step back, his small body bumping against the leg of the grand piano. He looked out at the sea of people, a forest of standing bodies with their hands clapping and their faces turned towards him. Some were smiling, some were crying, but all of them were focused on him. He didn't understand. He had just played a song. He had messed up at the beginning, and then he had tried to play it the way he heard it in his head. He didn't know it was supposed to be special. To him, it was just music. The loud, happy noise felt like it was for someone else, and he wished they would stop. He felt a familiar prickle behind his eyes, the sign that he was about to cry, and he bit his lower lip, trying to be brave. At the judges' table, Alistair Finch felt like he had been woken from a deep sleep. The spell of the music was broken, but its echo still resonated deep within him. He looked down at his notepad, at the single dismissive word he had written, "unsuitable." The word now seemed like a joke, a relic from a different lifetime. He felt a flush of shame creep up his neck. He, a man who considered himself a guardian of musical excellence, had almost silenced one of the most remarkable talents he would ever encounter. He had judged a book by its cover, or in this case, a musician by his size. He took a deep, shaky breath, trying to compose himself. He looked at Eleanor, who was still dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, as if to say, "You're the one. You have to speak." The roar of the crowd began to subside slightly as people sensed that the judges were about to respond. A hush started to fall, spreading from the front rows towards the back. It wasn't the same stunned silence as before. This was a silence of anticipation. Everyone wanted to hear what the man who had smirked would have to say now. Alistair slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. The simple movement commanded instant attention. The remaining whispers died away, and the auditorium became quiet once more. He walked to the edge of the judges' table, closer to the stage, and leaned towards the microphone. For a moment, he just looked at the small, frightened boy standing by the piano. He cleared his throat, and his voice, when it came through the speakers, was not the crisp, arrogant tone they had heard earlier. It was softer, rougher, thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. "Leo," he began, his voice cracking slightly on the boy's name. He paused, taking another breath to steady himself. "In my 30 years of sitting on panels like this one, I have seen many things. I have seen children with perfect technique but no heart. I have seen adults with all the passion in the world but not a shred of talent. I have heard thousands of performances, some good, some bad, most forgettable." He paused again, his eyes never leaving Leo's face. "I came here today feeling tired, feeling like I had heard it all. And when you walked out on this stage, I am ashamed to admit, I judged you. I saw a small boy in a big suit and I dismissed you. The smirk on my face was real, and it was a mistake. It was the biggest mistake I have ever made as a judge." A murmur went through the crowd, not of disapproval, but of surprise and respect for his honesty. Maria, who had been making her way down the aisle, stopped in her tracks, her hand over her mouth. "What you just did," Alistair continued, his voice growing stronger, filled with a newfound passion, "was not just a performance. It was a lesson. It was a reminder of why we first fell in love with music. It wasn't about the perfect notes, though they were perfect. It wasn't about the technique, though. It was flawless. It was about the soul. It was about a story being told with such purity and such joy that it stripped away all the nonsense, all the pretension, and left us with what truly matters. You didn't just play La Campanella, you became the music. And for a few minutes, you took all of us with you." He looked from Leo to the other judges, who were nodding in agreement, and then back to the boy. "We don't need to deliberate. There is nothing to discuss. Competitions like this have rules and rounds, but sometimes a moment comes along that is bigger than the rules. Tonight is one of those moments. Leo, you are not just going to the next round. You have already won. You have shown us all that true talent doesn't have an age, or a size, or a price tag. It just is. And you, young man, are what it is all about." As Alistair finished speaking, the auditorium erupted once more in a deafening roar of applause, even louder and more emotional than before. But Leo barely heard it, because at that moment, a figure burst through a side curtain and ran onto the stage. It was his mother. Maria had finally made it past the ushers and the rows of seats, and she ran to her son, her shoes squeaking on the polished floor. She didn't say a word. She just knelt down and wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a hug so tight he could barely breathe. She buried her face in his shoulder, and the tears she had been holding back finally came. Great racking sobs of relief and pride. Leo hugged her back, burying his face in her familiar, comforting smell. He felt safe again. "Mom," he whispered, his voice muffled by her dress. "Why is everyone so loud? Did I do something wrong?" Maria pulled back, her hands cupping his face, her thumbs wiping away his own tears. She laughed through her own tears, a beautiful, watery sound. "No, my love," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't do anything wrong. You did everything right. You were amazing. You were the best in the whole world." Leo just looked at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "But I messed up at the beginning." "Doesn't matter," she said, kissing his forehead. "It doesn't matter at all." Alistair Finch watched the mother and son on stage, a small, genuine smile on his face. He saw the way Maria held Leo, the way she looked at him as if he were the most precious thing in the world. He understood then. This wasn't a story about a prodigy. It was a story about love. It was about a mother who saw the magic in her son and gave him the chance to share it, and a son who loved his mother enough to be brave. He picked up his pen, crossed out the word unsuitable, and wrote a new one, unforgettable. With his mother's arm around his shoulders, Leo walked towards the edge of the stage. He was no longer the scared boy who had walked out, nor the confident musician who had commanded the piano. He was just Leo, a small boy with his mom. He looked out at the cheering crowd one last time, and this time, he didn't see a scary, noisy mob. He saw smiling faces. He saw people clapping for him, and a small, shy smile appeared on his own face. He gave a little wave, and then, with his mother leading the way, he walked off the stage and into the wings, leaving behind the grand piano and the roaring crowd, carrying with him the quiet, certain knowledge that he had done something good. He didn't know it yet, but he hadn't just won a competition. He had changed lives, most especially his own.